everyone. Welcome to our podcast. Today we are going to be discussing Acadia University's investment and endowment fund and what divestments would look like and from different perspectives of different theorists. So for a little bit of context on why we're talking about divestments, we're talking about Palestine and Israel. The Free Palestine movement is a global movement to liberate the Gaza Strip from Israeli forces. In 2025, the UN officially declared the war as a genocide. Israel and Palestine have had ongoing conflicts since the Second World War, when Jewish victims of the Holocaust were given to the state of Palestine, and tensions have been high between the two states and have had ongoing senses of colonization of the Palestinian people. Through financial investment, Acadia University financially supports the genocide and war in the Middle East. Jeff Hennessy is the president of the administration at Acadia. Aaron Baudin is the VP Finance and Operations, and the Board of Governor and Investment Committee are all responsible to these endowment funds. And it is their responsibility to decide where Acadia divests and invests in. So Acadia in 2023 invested over $60,000 just in Israeli banks alone. This does not include things like military, artillery, weapons, and that kind of thing. But we know that they are still investing in those as well. So today our podcast will take on multiple theoretical approaches to endowments and how we could maybe divest and what these philosophers would say about divestment. So we're going to move on to our first theorist, Aimé Césaire, Discourse on Colonialism.
So Avery, what is Discourse on Colonialism?
So Césaire's Discourse on Colonialism argues that colonization both dehumanizes the colonizer and the colonized. He highlights that colonization is not only about physical domination, but also moral and psychological devastation. He also points out that colonization corrupts civilization by normalizing violence and racism. He argues that as a society, we are capable of violence only when the victims are dehumanized. However, in doing this, we as the oppressors become immoral and morally compromised. Césaire argues that this transforms normal people into actors of cruelty by using them as tools for violence and to control the oppressed.
How do you think he would approach the issue?
He would argue that by investing in these institutions, it would dehumanize Jeff Hennessy, the Board of Governors, Acadia faculty, and Acadia students. Jeff Hennessy and the Board of Directors are responsible for overseeing Acadia's investments, so they would bear the weight of this moral decay. By deliberately continuing to invest, even with the knowledge of the ongoing genocide, Acadia would be complicit in the violence that is taking place in Palestine. By framing the Israeli occupation of Palestine as a continuation of colonial domination, he approaches and emphasizes that decolonization is both morally and materially oppressive to the oppressor and the colonized. And Césaire would call for solidarity and a cultural awakening within the Acadia community.
How do you think this would affect Acadia's students and faculty?
Césaire would argue that this dehumanizes Jeff Hennessy and the investment community, or the investment committee, the board of directors, and also the Acadia staff and students. But most Acadia staff and students are not aware of where the university invests their money. And by supporting Israel, Acadia blatantly disregards and disrespects Palestinian students and faculty by creating a space on campus that makes them feel unsafe. Césaire would argue that divestment affirms the university's commitment to human rights and creating a safer and more inclusive learning space for all students and faculty.
How does this affect Acadia from a political perspective?
Politically, Césaire would argue that divestment would position Acadia as a leader in ethical governance and global justice. By choosing to divest from Israeli companies and institutions, Acadia would publicly reject the structure of violence that Césaire identifies as colonial domination. Acadia would be demonstrating a commitment to political change rather than financial prosperity.
Why do you think Acadia might choose not to divest?
Césaire would acknowledge that the change in investment may cause political backlash from pro-Israel groups and alumni donors. However, his perspective highlights how resistance is needed when change is essential. Political risk in the name of humanity is what separates ethics from performance.
What is his overall message?
Justice cannot wait for universal approval. By supporting a system in which allows for colonization and inhumanity to imposes harm on the university. Caesar would argue that the tens of thousands of dollars being invested into Israeli corporations can be reinvested into local and federal charities to possibly help with the liberation of Gaza. By doing this, Acadia would again revive their morality, and by defunding Israeli corporations, Acadia University would take a step in rejecting Caesar's ideas of moral decay, and investing in Israeli companies is not only a financial support, but also a symbolic support of genocide. So next, Emma will be analyzing how Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto looks at Acadia's investments into Israeli militaries and institutions.
So, Emma, why do you think Marx and Engels would support divestment?
Well, Marx and Engels argued throughout history, dominant classes sought to fortify their already acquired status by subjecting society at large to their conditions of appropriation. This is from page 11. In other words, the ruling class uses institutions to include universities to protect its wealth. This is another quote from the manifesto. All previous historical movements were movements of minorities, or in the interest of the minorities. So from their perspective, if Acadia invests their money into industries built on exploitation, then the university is helping reproduce the same class dominance that they describe in the manifesto. They also insist that the proletariat movement represents the immense majority in the interest of the intense majority. Divestment campaigns are typically student-led, workers, and community members, which really fits this description well. On campus, we've seen various sit-ins from Acadia for Liberated Palestine, different protests, teach-ins, learn-ins, so there's definitely a lot of community members that are concerned about our endowments and would like to see change, so it's really important that this is rooted in community. They would also argue that the capitalist investment choices contribute directly to the exploitation of workers and people globally. Marx writes that the essential conditions for the existence of the bourgeoisie class is the formation and augmentation of capital. The condition for this capital is wage labor, which is on page 12. To them, Acadia investments are not neutral. They are part of a machinery that requires the exploitation of other people in order to grow. In this sense, divestment becomes an act of refusing to participate in the capitalist accumulation that rests on what Marx calls the exploitation of the many few, the exploitation of the laborers by the manufacturers on page 9. So the pro-divestment case from Marx and Engels' point of view is clear. Divestment weakens the bourgeoisie control over social institutions like our universities. It reflects on collective proletariat action. It interrupts the cycle of capital accumulation built on exploitation, and it moves society slightly closer to what Marx calls the dissolution of old conditions of existence, where the new social relations can emerge.
Why do you think Marx and Engels might critique divestment?
First, they would argue that most reforms within capitalist institutions don't actually transform the underlying system. They note that the bourgeoisie continually produces its own gravediggers on page 12, meaning that while capitalist systems contain revolutionary potential, reforms alone actually rarely overturn class domination, unfortunately. From their perspective, divestment does not abolish private property, nor does it sweep away the old conditions of production, so the exploitation of other people. A university shifting investments may feel radical, but the ownership structure of society and the exploitation built onto it remains fully intact. Marx and Engels would also warn against symbolic victories. They argue that capitalism adapts quickly. It absorbs and critiques itself and rebrands itself. If Acadia divests from one set of capitalist industries, it will most certainly reinvest and still rely on wage labor and surplus extraction, which means that the university's wealth would continue to depend on the organization power of one class over oppressing another, unfortunately. So their anti-divestment argument would be divestment does not actually abolish class relation or private property, which is the root of the issue. It may become an act of the bourgeoisie moralism rather than actual structural changes. Capitalism absorbs critique and Capitalism absorbs critiques and continues exploiting labor. And only proletariat political power, not investment shifts, can transform society.
So what do you think they would ultimately think?
Marx and Engels would view divestment as a good thing, but useful, but also limited and very static. It's consistent with the proletariat to push to expose exploitations, challenge capital, and build collective political consciousness. It kind of aligns with their claim within an old society, the elements of a new one has been created. So, but they would also insist that without deeper structural changes, without confronting private property, wage labor, class domination, divestments alone cannot overcome capitalism and the issues of capitalism and colonialism that are entangled together within the situation in Palestine. In their words, capitalism falls on the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. So that's from page 12. Divestment might be one small tremor in an ongoing shift, but not the earthquake itself, unfortunately. And now we can move on to Immanuel Kant's perspective.
Yeah,
So what do you think Kant's perspective would be?
So from Immanuel Kant's perspective, Acadia's investment in Israeli banks and technology firms represent a failure of enlightenment. By continuing to invest in institutions tied to violence and oppression, Acadia shows immaturity, a reliance on external authority, like financial systems, political pressure, or tradition, rather than independent moral reasoning. Kant would argue that Jeff Hennessy and the Board of Governors and the Overseer of Investments is complicit in this immaturity if he prioritizes financial gain over moral duty. Kant would stress that enlightenment demands transparency and accountability. If Acadia's community remains unaware of where their money is invested, they are denied the opportunity to act as rational agents. This ignorance perpetuates immaturity, leaving students and faculty unable to exercise their moral freedom. For Kant, true enlightenment requires that institutions foster conditions where individuals can think and act freely, whereas investment tied to oppression and undermines this whole idea.
How would Kant approach the issue?
Kant would approach Acadia's investments by framing them as a test of moral autonomy. He would argue that continuing to invest in Israeli companies tied to Gaza conflict is an act of heteronomy. Heteronomies align external pressures, profit, tradition, political alliances to dictate action rather than reason and duty. To act morally, Acadia must divest, not because it is financially advantageous, but because it aligns with the categorical imperative. Supporting oppression cannot be universalized as moral law, therefore must be rejected. Kant would call for Acadia to embrace enlightenment by fostering open debate, transparency, and rational discourse about its investments. Divestment would be a concrete step toward maturity, demonstrating the courage to act according to reason rather than convenience. He would argue that divestment affirms the dignity of all human beings, including Palestinian students and faculty, and create a safer, more rational academic environment.
How does this affect Acadia politically?
Politically, Kant would argue that divestment positions Acadia as a leader in moral governance. By rejecting investments tied to oppression, Acadia shows their courage to act autonomously, even in the face of backlash from pro Israeli groups or alumni donors. For Kant, resistance is not a reason to avoid moral duty, rather, it's a proof of the importance of acting according to reason rather than fear. He would insist that justice cannot wait for universal approval, but moral duty must be fulfilled regardless of political risk. Kant would also argue that reinvesting funds into humanitarian or educational initiatives reflect the university's commitment to enlightenment. Such actions would not only restore Acadia's moral integrity, but also encourage its community to dare to know and have courage to know your own reason. It's the motto of the Enlightenment, which encourage us to think critically about the ethical implications of financial decisions. In this way, divestment becomes both a moral and intellectual act, aligning Acadia with the principles of enlightenment and universal human dignity. Now let's move on to Macy, who will be presenting Sophocles' view on this matter, using the play Antigone as a foundation for discussion.
So, Sophocles' Antigone follows the titular character, Antigone, as she attempts to bury the body of her brother, Polynices, against the wishes of her uncle, King Creon. Within the play, Sophocles explores the concepts of morality as well as highlights the political argument of objecting to authority. Through fictional events, he expresses his stance that when authority enforces or enables injustice, it violates moral truths. When considering Acadia University's investments in Israeli banks and technology firms, this ideology becomes particularly significant.
Do you think they would support this?
I believe Sophocles would criticize this issue by stating that divesting in companies that link the university to violent conflict is a moral imperative aligned with democratic leadership, community voice, and universal ethics. Within the classical Greek tragedy, Sophocles writes, my voice is the one voice giving orders in the city. Hymen, it is no city if it takes orders from one voice. And Creon states, the state is the king. Hymen states, yes, if the state is a desert. And that's from 596 to 598. As Creon asserts his authority as king, and Hymen argues against him, it conveys Sophocles' ideals to the audience. That to be a true leader, you have to have input from the people and know what is best. And to know what is best for the city is to listen to the people of the city. That the collection of voices and opinions should be shared and valued, not suppressed. This ideal can be related to Acadia University's Israeli investments, as despite the global student activism for the Free Palestine movement, which was created to liberate the Gaza Strip from Israeli forces, as well as the outcry from students and advocacy groups to divest from firms complicit in the occupation of Palestine, the school has not taken any steps. Thus, by considering Hymen's emphasis about justice, dignity, and respect for life, we can apply these values to Acadia and understand Sophocles would probably say that divesting isn't just a political stance, it's a moral one, an act that stands above finances and refuses to stay complicit in injustice.
How do you think the play's themes suggest this?
Antigone's themes suggest that communities, not just individuals, have the right and possibly the duty to refuse allegiance to immoral decisions. For Acadia, this means recognizing that financial decisions are not morally neutral. Investments reflect values. When institutions fund or support systems of violence, injustice, or oppression, they risk loss of legitimacy. Following Sophocles' moral logic, refusing complicity becomes an ethical obligation rather than a political preference. Continuing to invest in these companies while students are calling for divestment puts Acadia in Creon's position of insisting that authority matters more than community input. From Sophocles' point of view, that's exactly how institutions lose their integrity, by choosing pride or convenience over ethical responsibility. Today, in 2025, financial investments are not morally neutral. Institutions must ask themselves, do these investments uphold or violate a universal morality? Now, Emma will be discussing how Mahatma Gandhi would view Acadia's investments into Israeli military
and state projects using the Penguin Gandhi reader to validate her claims.
So, what does Gandhi argue?
Gandhi discusses a few topics within his texts, mainly on the topic of the colonization of India by the Europeans. In his chapter titled Civilization, he first critiques the concept of Western civilization, encouraging India to reject Western traditions. He explains how it's over-focused on technological advancements and centered around materialism. He states that it's ultimately headed for destruction. All of these values are things that India has not previously considered a priority. Gandhi argues for the rejections of these traditions while simultaneously acknowledging that it is difficult to get rid of these things. In terms of handling conflict, his text, The Doctrine of the Sword, vouches for the approach of nonviolence, stating that it does not mean meek submission at the will of the evildoer, but it means putting of one's whole soul against the will of the tyrant. And that's from page 100. Although he does encourage nonviolence, there is also a section of the text that speaks to how violence should only be used when necessary. His son asks him, should he step back and do nothing when his father is attacked, or should he use violence against them? And Gandhi says, in that instance, I would expect you to use violence.
So, what do you think Gandhi's overall opinion would be on this issue?
I think that Gandhi would first be disappointed in the type of institution the university is investing in. In the text, Gandhi places a lot of emphasis focusing on spirituality opposed to money and technological advancement. He explains how Western civilization encourages development, whether this be labor technology, literature, vehicles, or weapons. It provides the notion that Gandhi believes this is only to increase wealth and diminishes meaningful work. Gandhi would also be disappointed with whose institutions the universities are investing in. Gandhi's texts discuss how the colonization of India has negatively affected the area, changing a lot of their traditions and morals. The Israel-Palestine conflict has resulted in something very similar. Israel has been attacking and killing Palestinians, and in doing this is causing a cultural genocide. Not only are Palestinians not able to continue practicing their political traditions, but they are also unable to rest in their homes safely out of fear of the next bombing or disaster.
How do you think he would feel about how Acadia students are handling their disappointment with the university?
I think that Gandhi would encourage the students to continue doing what they are doing. He praises the approach of nonviolence, stating, I am not a visionary. I claim to be a practical idealist. The religion of nonviolence is not meant merely for the saints. It is meant for the common people as well. Nonviolence is the law of our species, while violence is the law of the brute. This is from page 99. The students in this situation are those at the bottom of the hierarchy at the university. They are using the power they have by performing sit-ins, teach-ins, protests, and gathering outside of MP's office. The students are using the tools of nonviolence, as Gandhi says, to acknowledge an issue which is destructive to a group's culture, practices, and well-being. They are using the tools and protesting an issue which is similar to that Gandhi is arguing.
Thank you so much for listening to our podcast. It's been a great conversation with all of you guys, and also I love to hear about all the theorists that we have approached and regarding this issue. Thank you so much.